Keith Veshecco was one of those guys who was a permanent fixture on the Erie music scene throughout the 1970s and 1980s. If you didn't encounter him when he was working at Markham's Music, maybe you knew him from the many bands he played in. Or maybe you knew him as John Mazza's business partner in Twang Recording Studios, where he produced, mixed, mastered, and played on a bunch of local recordings. His ubiquity on the Erie music scene during those decades is evident if you've been a regular listener of this podcast, as so many of my guests have mentioned his name and in many cases thanked him for all he had done for them. Keith passed away at the age of 59 on Saturday, August 18th, 2012. I want to read a portion of his obituary so I don't get anything wrong, and so you know who he was in case you're listening and you didn't know him. The obituary says, he was born in Erie on May 30th, 1953, the son of Elizabeth and Michael Veshecco. Keith was a musician, period. He worked for the last 40 years as a guitarist, writer, producer, and engineer with a large amount of talented musicians and songwriters from Erie and the tri-state area. He played in bands like ATV, Mr. Gone, Friction, Rhythm Method, and the Ouija Boys, to name a few. He produced a wide range of acts from Dirty Looks, Amanda Post, Friction, Eastern Smile, The Prodigies, Dollhouse Caper, The Earthquakers, ATV, The Peens, Ed Russell, The Frenchmen, and many more, in addition to engineering countless others. He founded Twang Recording Studios in 1977 with partner John Mazza and was still active recording as TRS Audio Services, still partnered with John. He still mixed live sound as well, having worked mostly with the M80s for the past 4 years, in addition to independent productions and festivals. Since 2004, Keith has worked in sales with Robert Lewis and Associates in the music industry. So that's the obituary. Now, when I first thought of doing this episode, I sent a message out on Facebook asking folks to send me their recollections of Keith. I said it could be anything. It could be a gig, a recording session, or just hanging out with him, whatever your memories of him were. Now, of course, not everyone is on Facebook, and not everyone who knew him well may have seen my message about this episode. So I wanted to apologize to folks who may have wanted to contribute to this episode. I didn't leave out anyone intentionally. In fact, I included all the comments that were sent to me. For those of you who would still like to share your favorite memories of Keith, I'd encourage you to go to the Erie Music History Podcast Facebook page and comment there. Or if you're not on Facebook, you can send me an email at eriemusichistorypodcast@gmail.com. That's eriemusichistorypodcast@gmail.com, and I'll post your comments to the Facebook page. Now, before I get into the stuff that people sent me about Keith, I wanted to share some Facebook comments that I compiled after reading through the past rockin' bands and musicians of Erie. A lot of folks had commented on Keith over the years, and I wanted to include some of those. Some of these are from way back in 2012 when he passed away, and others are more recent. So we'll start with Frank Coletta in 2020. Frank wrote, Keith was our guru back in the 80s. We were a cover band and he worked a lot. He was fantastic in helping us with the gear we needed to buy on a regular basis. He even showed up at one of our gigs to help the sound guy navigate the new mixer he had sold us. We were just kids, but he didn't take advantage of us. He was a terrific guy. John Rainey, another great and well-known Erie musician who recently passed away, he had written a few years ago about Keith. He said, Keith was not only a great musician, but a great guy. Thanks to him, I got my first job at Markham's Music. He taught me a lot about guitar repair. Thank you, Keith. Dickie Buckle, who has been on this podcast, he was a longtime member of the Cows and plenty of other bands in Erie. Dickie wrote, I remember many recording sessions with Keith and John Mazza. We always had a lot of laughs. Keith was very meticulous about recording our sound. Also, many visits to Markham's Music where he would let me know about the latest music biz stuff. He was a good man and a good friend. Paul Kelvington wrote, Keith recorded my band Modern Image and showed 5 teenage new wave studio newbies how to get a sound plus a performance out of a band. And longtime Erie musician Joe Parker wrote, Keith had an amazing spirit that shined with his music. It didn't matter what part of the business. His spirit will always be with us in all of our music endeavors. Keith, in his own way, set the bar for us for years to come, until we meet again. Now, in the obituary, it listed a number of the bands that Keith played in. I just wanted to list a few other ones that weren't listed there. Some of those include Desperado, which eventually, I think Desperado may have come before ATV or vice versa. I'm sure someone will correct me on that. Desperado, Twang. Keith played in Tennessee Back Porch for a while. He played in Freudian Slip, Anacrusis, and Dangerous Age. And I'm sure there are some that I'm missing. So feel free to post those on the Facebook page also. So let's get into some of the emails and audio files that folks sent me for this episode. All right, the first submission I have is probably from the youngest musician that we have. It's Rob Neville from the M80s. Rob says, the best that I can say is that I cannot think of a nicer, more knowledgeable, gifted musician than Keith. My favorite thing is he always knew the answer to any technical question I had and was willing to help. You have to remember, I was just a stupid kid who used to hang around Markham staring at things that I couldn't afford and really couldn't play very well. That was a lot of us. He never made me feel bad or ran me off. When I started the M80s, I had not spoken to him in a while, and I was really hesitant to call him and ask for help. When I did, he finally came over and helped with all the equipment, getting it up and running, and he was there every step of the way. He was like the seventh member of the M80s, just way more talented and more knowledgeable. He was hugely instrumental in making that band a success. I have to say that for years after his death, almost daily, I would think to myself, I have to call Keith and get his advice. A second after thinking that, I would realize he was gone. It would make me sad all over again. During the period before he became ill, I would have long conversations with him about all kinds of things. He gave me encouragement and guidance about all sorts of musical-related things, and he was really bright and not just about band geek stuff. I just miss him a ton. He was a true friend. He had a quirky sense of humor that if you didn't know him, you might think he was being really hard. I can't tell you how many times I got off stage after what I thought was a great performance, and he would say, "Hey, what happened during that solo?" And he'd shoot me that funny smile, and we'd laugh. But it made me go home and practice more. I miss him a bunch. I'm not sure that this is what you're looking for, but I could talk all day about Keith. He was one of the best. This one's from Jim Buman, another longtime Erie guitar player in town. Jim says that I went to McDowell High School where Keith went as well. After school, we ran into each other a few years later when we were both working at a tool shop together. We were both guitar players and in bands, therefore had a lot in common. Keith was a down-to-earth, great guy and well-respected in the music industry. His recording studio, Twang, did the 45 record for my band Guardian. He was awesome to work with. In fact, on one of the tracks, he came up with a great guitar part and put it down on a quick test recording. It turned out awesome, so we kept it on the recording. Just a great and talented person. I miss him. This one is from Paula Holmes, who played in Ruby Port and a bunch of other bands. Paula says, and this is a bit of a long one, but that's okay. Paula says, in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a real network of young musicians in the Erie area. I was blessed to be around that. Most of us knew each other. Bands formed and reformed in various configurations, and we were all friends. Like many others, that's how I got to know Keith, mainly through Tom Stone and Bob Tome. Keith was such a great guitarist and vocalist who grew into an ace sound engineer and producer. For a time, he worked with our band Clockwise and even came along on one of our mini tours. That was probably when I really got to know that his kindness and goodness ran as deep as his talents. And I liked the way that he always made me sound the way I wanted to sound when I sang. He wasn't thrown by any of the weird dynamics of my vocals. In fact, he used to just tease me about it. I could probably come up with quite a few memories of our collective band adventures. I just knew that if Keith was behind the board, things would be fine. And that's a lovely thing to be sure of when you're performing. I do have one sort of amusing memory which may sound far too personal, but I will tell it anyway. All right, this is a good one. She says, years after I left to live in England, my husband Phil and I came back to Erie for Christmas in 1981. We had lost our first baby, and we were very keen to try for another pregnancy and hopefully a child. We planned the trying thing down to the exact date. On the evening of that date, I was slated to record something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was going to be at Keith's West 29th Street studio, with Angelo Natali directing me and Keith recording the session. Before I went to the session, I laughed and told Phil to wait up for me no matter how late I was. Well, the session went on and on and on, hours longer than I had thought it would. That was good, Paula, but let's try this way, or let's try it that way. And it got so late that I half-jokingly said to Keith and Ange, if I never have children, it will be your fault. They looked at me like a deer in the headlights. Finally, the session was over, and I came home to Phil snoring in front of my parents' TV while the national anthem was playing. Remember, that was a long time ago. Long story short, things did go according to plan, and I gave birth the following October to our son, Paul. To this day, I think some of Keith and Ange's vibes had something to do with it because, guess what? Paul became one of the greatest guitarists and composers you'll ever hear. Crazy but true. Those guys must have been like his fairy godfathers or something. So that is from Paula Holmes. And if you want to hear more about Paula's son, check out the mini episode that I did in season 1. All right. This one is from Tim McLaughlin. Tim says, Keith always called me Timmy. Only people that knew me when I was a little kid would call me that. And Keith. The first time I met Keith must have been around 1972. Chords sounded sour on my Les Paul, so I took it to the old Markham's Music on 11th Street. I had just put new strings on it and couldn't figure out why it couldn't be tuned or intonated. All the chords sounded sour. He looked at it, made a few adjustments, and then assessed that the brand new D string was at fault. He put a new one on, and bingo, in tune. I never knew that a brand new string could be bad. He rewired that Les Paul to do out of phasing and split coil humbuckers too. Keith never laughed at my early attempt at building guitars. Finding guitar parts was difficult before the internet, but he always had a good supply of used parts at Markham's for me to purchase. That was Tim McLaughlin. Tony Ferrara, he is the guitarist in The Groove, and he was in the Moonlighters, obviously. So Tony says, this is one vivid memory I have of my chats with Keith. Whenever I think of it, I'm reminded of how naive I was. I wish it were more entertaining, but I'm sure Ed, Durf, Kevin, and Steve will all have a million of those, to name a few. So Tony says, during the years when the Moonlighters were playing Aunt Mary's, just west of the Holiday Inn downtown on 18th Street, the owner of Aunt Mary's and possibly another partner brought in Three Dog Night to play the Warner Theater. He asked the Moonlighters to open the show. We were really excited for the opportunity to play on a larger stage. Several days later, Keith and I were talking about how the gig went, and I told Keith that it was fine, but it could have been better if the monitors weren't going from being off to practically blasting us off the stage. It was very disorienting. Keith's response was a grin and a hand gesture indicating we were getting played by the sound team. It never occurred to me that anyone would do that intentionally to a band, make them sound bad. Keith assured me it was par for the course and nothing out of the ordinary. In a weird way, I actually felt better about it after our chat. Another point he makes is, it's one thing to learn to play an instrument, but there are so many other topics that musicians need to understand, and Keith was always an encyclopedia of knowledge when it came to anything related to music. I learned a great deal and have many wonderful memories from my days teaching at Markham's when I'd go over to the store and hang out in between lessons. Okay, this one is from Durf Hopseger. Durf says Keith was a multifaceted guy. I remember seeing him in the 75, 76 era with twang. He sang lead on Cold Ethel by Alice Cooper. It's a far cry from those smooth CSN harmonies that he did later on with Mr. Gone. Here's a longer anecdote. Keith bought the house at 1116 West 29th Street. No, 11116. He bought the house on West 29th Street in June of 1978. That was the first official studio location, and I was his first roommate. We made a cute couple. All right, Durf. He had guitars, basses, and recording gear, and I had basses, guitars, and keyboards. It amazes me that anyone dated us at all. There was gear everywhere. I was 24 and he was 25. Two wild single musicians, huh? He juggled his job at Markham's Music, playing in ATV and the studio. I played full-time at first and then worked at You Frame It and played 3 nights with Starfire. We were both busy, but we always had a standing date for Monday nights at 9:30. Party on! There was a pizza shop on the corner, so it was fish dinners and WKRP in Cincinnati on TV. I'm not sure why the pizza shop was serving fish dinners, but so they were watching WKRP in Cincinnati on TV Monday nights at 9:30, and he said it was just a little time to hang out and talk. Life's simple pleasures. What an intelligent, talented, decent guy he was. So that is Durf Hopsager. Here's one from Julie Moore. Chris and Julie Moore play in Tennessee Back Porch, obviously, and have for a long time. Julie says, we played with Keith a couple of different times when he helped fill in for Tennessee Back Porch when we had Paul Gall playing bass in the band because they had the band Mr. Gone going on, and we thought it would be a perfect fit since Paul and he could do some of their tunes too. We were in a mode of looking for someone, and he was so gracious to fill in. My favorite memory is our duet singing Shiny Happy People with Keith, which is the song by REM. That song will always remind me of him, shining and happy. It was an honor to have such an amazing artist to collaborate with. I was also in awe of how much he sounded exactly like the guitar solos in every song he learned. Mr. Gone played for my 30th surprise birthday party, and that was the best thing about the party. I could have stood there in front of him to listen all night. We also recorded some tracks in his studio, and he could not have been more professional. We love you, Keith. Thank you for gracing Erie with your spirit. All right, this one's from Mark Garzicki. Great guitar player, played in Easy. He plays in a bunch of bands over the years, but here's what he has to say. He said, it was an honor working in a band with him and knowing Keith as a friend. In the rhythm method, we always started the night off with a first set joke that was told on stage just between us, the band. The band was playing at Sherlock's one night. Keith told this joke, and the punchline was, hey, honey, watch out. Don't fall in that hole. Just as he said that, there was a hole in the stage where bands ran the snake box and cables. Keith stepped into the hole in the middle of the 4 count to start the first song. It was a hoot. However, Keith did hurt himself a bit overall, but he was okay. So that's Mark Garzicki's comment. Okay, right here I'm going to interject a audio file that Ed Pouton or Ed Russell sent me that gives his thoughts on Keith.
Hey, Chip. Hello, everybody. It's Ed Russell Pouton. I hope all is well. In regards to Keith Veshecco, I would like to make a comment about how I met him and his initial kindness. Keith must have lived about a 45-minute walk away from me, and I had just received my first guitar amplifier, which was a Vox Cambridge Reverb, and it had that nifty little Vox stand, and I had an absolutely horrific guitar. I think the strings must have been made out of Nazi Germany barbed wire, and I didn't know what to do with the amp, and I think Dick Bullings had given my parents a cord, but of course my mother didn't know about that, and it was in the package. But I couldn't figure out how the amplifier worked because I didn't know you needed a cord to plug the damn thing in. So I was friends with Keith because we went to high school together, and he walked all the way down to 1107 West Grandview, all the way from Cherry Street Extension. That's a walk, my friend, past the reservoir. We all know where this is. And he walked into the house, and this is what he sounded like. Ed, you've got to plug the damn thing in. It's not going to work through the air. I go, oh, he goes, do you have a patch cord? I go, yes, Keith. And he goes, well, that's good. You're in the right direction. And then he showed me everything. He goes, this is reverb, makes it echo. This is treble. This is your highs, like your stereo system. And we were always close friends. Keith got me my first job at Markham's. I don't think I was out of high school. Keith Veshecco and John Mazza were forever helpful for me. And you want to know what? I want to tell everybody there's nobody in the world that I love, obviously besides my family and my wife, like Keith Veshecco. May Keith rest in peace. And I hope everybody else has something nice to say. Bye-bye.
All right, this one is from Kevin Bensick. You might know him as Antoine Jack. He and Keith were really close friends, and he has sent me a well-written, a longer story. So this is a great one. I want to read the whole thing. So he said, my story is not directly about Keith, but rather his influence. In the mid-1970s, John Mazza and I had the opportunity to buy a used ARP 2600 synthesizer for a ridiculously low cost. If you're not familiar with the ARP 2600, it was a large portable suitcase system that used patch cords and cables and sliders and knobs to make wonderful sounds. Famously, it was utilized by Edgar Winter on Frankenstein, and it was also used by the Weather Report for the intro to Birdland. It was a beast of a machine, and it was very uncommon to find, especially at a bargain basement price like we got it for. There was a catch, though. It needed service, the kind that could only be had at the ARP synthesizer factory in Boston. So, one wintry day in February of 1976, John Mazza, myself, and our good friend Durf Hopsager got into my 1975 Subaru station wagon and headed to Boston. The ARP in tow. Somewhere outside of Buffalo, the car started running rough, and quick stop at a rest area revealed a problem with the ignition, specifically the distributor cap. This was the days before the days of electronic ignitions, and rotor points, plugs, and wires was a regular maintenance routine. Now, if memory serves me, this was a long time ago, he says. We discovered a cracked distributor cap, and we were able to temporarily fix it with duct tape. So we proceeded. Heading east across New York State, the car would occasionally show signs of distress, but we forged on. At the toll booth leaving the New York Thruway at our exit to Boston, the distributor cap totally failed, and the engine quit, and we were dead in the water, or snow, as they say. A tow truck was arranged for, and a call was made to our hotel to explain the situation and to keep our reservation intact, as we were now several hours behind our scheduled arrival time. We got to the hotel in Boston about 7 a.m. with the Subaru dropped off in the parking lot. A quick search of the phone book led us to a nearby Porsche Subaru dealership, and again, a tow truck was summoned. When we arrived at the dealership, I was informed that the service department was not open since it was Saturday, but the parts department was open. So I was able to get what I needed to, hopefully, repair the ignition, a new distributor cap and a rotor. They were gracious enough to lend me some tools, and I proceeded to replace the cap and rotor, reconnect the ignition coil and spark plug wires while in their parking lot. Everything replaced, and we were on our way. Turned the key, but the car did not start. It turned over, it chugged, it wheezed, it spit, but it did not start. Check the paperwork with the parts. Let's see what it says. Now, earlier I mentioned points. The rotor arm inside a distributor cap is driven by a cam that opens and closes an electrical switch. Like I said, this is a long one, so stick with us. The Those points, which then sends the charge from the ignition coil through the rotor to the individual spark plugs of each cylinder running the engine. Okay, so you got these points, and there needs to be a gap. According to the paperwork, the points on the rotor had to be gapped or spaced exactly at 0.0020 inches, which is 22 thousandths of an inch. No more, no less. There is a very specific tool for this procedure, but I didn't need it. I instantly recall the conversation that I had had with Keith not long before this trip. It had nothing to do with cars, but rather guitar picks. In that moment, I could hear Keith's voice as clear as a bell saying, "A Fender medium guitar pick is 20 thousandths of an inch thick." I reached in my pocket, pulled out a bunch of change and guitar picks, rummaged around, and produced a Fender medium pick, which I used to set the gap on the rotor. The Subaru roared to life, and we continued our adventures in Boston. Keith saved the day, and he wasn't even there. Thanks again, old friend. All right, here's another audio file. This time it's from Monica Lewis. Take a listen.
So when it comes to music, I was a really, really late bloomer. I didn't know I could sing until I discovered it by accident in my late 20s. And once I made that discovery, I was obsessed with learning everything I could about music, about singing, about bands. And Keith Veshecco was one of a small handful of great guys who gave me advice, provided some tips on singing, told me about what it was like to be in a band, and opened some very, very early doors for me. I remember specifically telling him at his studio one day, actually we were talking about what it's like for women being in bands with guys, and he was giving me some really frank advice about it. And I remember saying to him, to hell with that, I'm going to start my own. And women, there weren't very many who did that, back then. And he said to me, and I can still hear his voice saying it, he said, "Well, Monica, if anybody can do it, you can." And it took me decades to actually do it because I got married. I had my beautiful daughter and raised her. And I decided to start my band Stiletto on the drive home from dropping my daughter off for her first year of college. And I remember driving down I-79, making that decision and thinking of Keith Veshecco and his words to me. And, years later, after, a successful local band fronted by three powerful female singers, I remember thinking, boy, Keith would have loved to have seen this. And he would love to know that he was a big part of, the inspiration that he gave me. He was a big part of this. And so I'll always remember him so fondly because of that and so many other things. He was just a lovely person, gentle and sweet and kind. And I'll never forget his little soft-spoken voice. He had that little lisp and had this gentle, really almost hard to hear voice sometimes. And I remember it was just so uncharacteristic of this badass rock and roll guitar player that I knew. I thought it didn't fit, but then again, it was perfect because it was him. And man, oh man, could that guy play guitar. Oh yeah, one last thing. Keith Veshecco, thank you for introducing me to Chinese food. I love you and I miss you. And I'll see you someday in rock and roll heaven.
All right, these next comments are from Bob Tome. He writes, "We all have a friend who goes a bit too far, a friend who parties a little bit too hard. I was that friend for Keith, and he tolerated me. I first met him in 8th grade when we were in Little Gritters football together, and we played for Marine Bank. Our paths crossed briefly over the years as we both began playing in bands, but it wasn't until 1974 when we were working on the Clockwise album that I really got to know him. We did all of our prep demos at Keith and John Mazza's 29th Street studio. Keith worked really well with both Al Perkins, who had worked with the likes of Graham Parsons, the Burrito Brothers, and J.D. Souther, and Dale Peters, who had worked with the James Gang. Keith was just another part of the team and fit in there like a glove. What I'm personally grateful for was Keith's generosity in bringing guitars to the sessions that were the perfect fit for the parts. One song just needed a jazz box ES-175 sound. Guess what? Keith had one. Another used an electric sitar part. That was his also. Another song had a bridge that needed an electric 12-string part, and he brought in a double-neck Gibson SG that belonged to a guy named Steve Schofield, who also worked at Markham's. Keith was instrumental in the Clockwise effort. One great story about Keith involved his days in ATV. Pat Tellerico had a treasured signature black Gibson SJ custom guitar. It was like a $4,000 guitar. He was naturally very protective of it. Keith conspired to find a cheap knockoff of it and painted it to match. Then, while on a break, a fake drunk guy was instructed to pick up the duplicate in Pat's view and fall on it, breaking it badly. Pat was so angry it cleared the bar. It ended up not being totally funny at the time, but in hindsight, it was a pretty good caper. Over the years, Keith helped me a lot with my guitars. I had a 56 Les Paul that had been routed for humbuckers, and I wanted a Veritone switch put in. Keith and Kevin Bensick went to work on it and routed the cavity, wired it up, and put on a new plastic cover. It looked factory and sounded great. I could do an out-of-phase rhythm setting that sounded like an acoustic, so that helped me a lot. Probably my most vivid memory from those days in Keith was when my Les Paul took a spill at a gig and broke at the headstock. Keith whisked it away from the scene and sent it to Virgil Lay, where it came back totally refinished like a brand new guitar. I swear it played better than ever. After I moved to Florida, I came back to Erie, and Keith was one of the people I always made time to see and talk with. It was always great seeing him. This one is from David Greenberger. David writes, I was in a band with Keith, my first bands really, in 1967 through 1969. We lived in the same neighborhood, and I have vague memories of the time we'd spend in basements working on and learning songs and just being in a band. He was a grade ahead of me, and after ninth grade, I went on to other bands, and then I left Erie after going to Mercyhurst College for a year. But back in the day, I remember hanging out at his house and listening to the stereo in their living room. They had flocked wallpaper with images of fountains and whatnot. I guess it was Rome. I associate Cream's Disraeli Gears album with that house, as we must have played it a lot in that living room when it was brand new. I kept a notebook of all of our jobs, where they were, what we were paid, personnel changes, and other bits of data and photos. Now, this is Chip again. From there, in David's message, he sent me a list of all of their gigs, so I'm going to summarize a few for you. So the name of the band was The Night Times, and it was Tymes, and then it morphed into Scotland Yard Fantasy, both great names, I think. So the Night Times was formed in September of 1967, and the guys in that band were Keith Veshecco on lead guitars and vocals, Doug Rogers on drums and vocals, Gary Bronson on lead vocals and rhythm guitar, David Greenberger on bass guitar, and Bill Pawlowski on organ. I apologize, Bill, if I messed up your name. Bill joined in 1968. So David lists 21 gigs with the band playing from December of 1967 to July of 1968, so about 7 months. And so 21 gigs in 7 months. A lot of those were, as you can imagine, YCO gigs where they got paid $5 or $6, the whole band. The most they ever got paid during that period was $25 for some private parties and school gigs. So then in July of 1968, they had a number of personnel changes, and the band continued to play for another year with about 26 more gigs, which is a lot for these are young kids at the time. Their pay went up, with it ranging from $10 to $42, so they were making the big bucks. They played private parties, church dances, of course, Wyco, and someplace called The Depths. So that is David Greenberger's memories. All right, this last one is from Steve McConnell, who also was super close with Keith, and also this is a long one too. I first met Keith in 1967, the first year I began drumming. I had a temporary drum instructor, a band teacher from McDowell, but I was on a waiting list to take lessons from Flip Bellotti at Markham's Music on West 11th Street. So I started hanging out at Markham's, which is where Keith worked. Keith came off pretty low-key, and I remember he was always holding a black Les Paul that he had pulled down from the rack. I used to bring members of my first trio, your typical junior high garage band, to the store, and we would all stand in awe as to how accurate Keith was when playing really difficult guitar parts from bands like Led Zeppelin, Yes, Genesis, and Crosby, Stills and Nash. Keith was 2 years older than me, and while I was still at Westlake Junior High, he would come over to my parents' house and jam with me, just the two of us, guitar and drums. Slowly, he started bringing other guys around, like Paul Gall, Vinnie Stefanelli, Drew DeCrease, and others. He was really instrumental in essentially endorsing me to many older musicians in town. I really can't calculate how much Keith assisted me in my progress to finally getting up to the level of playing with professional musicians for money. But it did happen rather quickly. At this point, we were friends, and by the time I got to 9th grade, Keith had a driver's license, and we would go to concerts in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, wherever, and then we saw some really great shows. Eventually, after a short sequence of garage bands, I was able to get a gig with Anthem Max, which were all older music majors at nearby colleges. Bob Sadowski, Brian Fells, and Lou Urosevic, I may have said that wrong, rounded out the quartet. All of them were fabulous musicians. It was a big step up for me, considering I was only in 10th grade, and Anthem Max lasted for about another year, I believe. During that time, I kept in contact with Keith and frequently told him how appreciative I was that he had supported me and got me in a band that was playing gigs for money regularly. Years passed and we stayed in touch. I always admired how Keith took the time to not only learn parts of a song, but to tediously duplicate the tone and the technical execution of a song. He had a tremendous ear. Keith was one of the best guitarists I've ever worked with. He was also a borderline genius with computers and technology, or basically anything that ran on electricity. Over the years, while he and I were playing with Chuck Leone and Paul Gall, Keith acquired the nickname Spock. We uttered this in total reverence because when it came down to a decision on anything, Keith was usually right every time, annoyingly so, but like Mr. Spock, he would calmly spell out his rationale, which was always difficult to disagree with. At Keith's funeral, it was difficult for me to convey to everyone in attendance what it was like being his friend all those years. I actually considered him one of my best friends. Even though we had had a disagreement years prior and didn't speak for nearly a year, we always came back to our friendship. Music got past our differences. Just before he passed, I had the privilege of telling him that I loved him. He replied, "I love you too, man." I miss Keith every day, but it's reassuring to know that he is no longer in pain. He had a huge impact on my life and still does. Keith was an extremely rare, special person. He had an overabundance of skills and talents, even though he was a bit difficult to understand sometimes. Yet, just like Spock, there was always that rational core to him. He was calm, subdued, and cerebral. My life is better having known Keith, and I'm proud to say he was my friend. All right, and I thought the following comment by Antoine Jack or Kevin Bensick on a photo on Facebook was a good one to end this episode on. Keith, you are not forgotten, and you are not simply remembered. You are missed by many, my friend. Love you, man. R.I.P. Thanks for listening to this special episode of the Erie Music History Podcast.